Please join me in prayer. God, we come to you to worship you and hear from you. Open our hearts and minds to hear what you have to say and free our wills to follow you. With my mouth to speak your words to your service and praise. Amen. So February 23rd, 2020, until August 2021, I was pastor at Bloomingdale Mennonite Church. And even though I was there for a year and a half, I preached in that building only one time in that whole time that I preached there. Just don't look at the pictures right now, they're coming soon. I preached on March the 1st, 2020, and then Laurel preached on the 8th of March. And then the next time we met was for Good Friday on April the 10th. COVID came in between there, and we weren't allowed to gather. It was clear that we wouldn't be worshiping in person for some time, at least if we wanted to be legal and safe. There were voices around us critical of us obeying the government instead of obeying God according to them. And there were other voices who said that if we gathered together to worship under COVID, then we weren't really being Christian. Where was the love for our weakest, for our neighbors? But I'm going astray here. Eating with enemies is our topic for today. And our scripture today comes from what scholars call the Deuteronomistic materials, the last book of those materials. If you start in Deuteronomy, you'll find that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, just continue an ongoing story, a story of history and theology. Esther and Ruth are just kind of thrown in as extras in there. Well, Deuteronomy is often considered part of the Torah, the law. It's really the introduction to the holy history of the Jews from their foundation as a nation until the exile in Babylon. Now, what's really interesting is that the Jews count these books, other than Deuteronomy, not as history, not as writings like they do 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, but as prophecy. They acknowledge that these books are far more theology, understanding God in relation to humanity, than they are history. These books were written during the exile, or at least finished and polished at that point. These are stories that were to form people during the exile and beyond as God's people, no matter where they are or what is happening to them around them. And so we find in this story focused on the prophet Elisha, successor to Elijah. He's at home in Dothan, near Samaria, the capital of the northern Jewish kingdom of Israel. Now, sometimes we think of Israel as being the enemy of Judah and not being right, but until it was destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians, it was seen as a sister nation to Judah and still God's people. They had God's prophets among them, trying to move them to worship God and not other gods, to be just and righteous people. Aram, or we might call it Syria with its capital at Damascus, was a longtime enemy of both Israel and Judah. And you have to remember, these were all tiny kingdoms, all of them. They weren't empires, but they all thought of the possibility of empire, even Judah and Israel. So the Arameans, Syrians, came raiding across the borders of Israel. I imagine that the raids went the other way as well, but it feels like Israel is the weaker of the two nations, and that Israelite king feels put upon. The fact that neither the Israelite king nor the king of Aram are named in this story should tell us that the history isn't so important. It's what's happening within the story that's important. It's a story to strengthen the people and to teach them about God, about the Lord, about Yahweh, instead of other gods like Baal and Asherah. And this would have been especially important as they either sat in Babylon or in Egypt, or maybe they had remained behind in Judah and Jerusalem when the book was written in the exile, in the ruins of the city of Jerusalem. So the king of Aram was sending raiding parties across the border, but somehow or other, his plans kept on being made known to the king of Israel. The man of God, Elisha, somehow was getting this knowledge and passing it on to the king of Israel. And this happened enough for the king of Aram to think that he had a spy among his officers who was feeding information to the Israelites. But one of his officers said, no. It's that Hebrew prophet Elisha. Now, how he knew that, I don't know, but somehow or other they knew. So the king of Aram asked where Elisha was to go and neutralize him. And when he found out that Elisha lived at Dothan, he sent troops in the night to surround it. And in the morning, Elisha's servant got up and opened the shutters, and there was the army of Aram around them. And he was terrified, as I would be, and I'm sure you would be as well. But Elisha asked God to open up his servant's eyes, because between Elisha and the Aramean troops, was a circle of horsemen and chariots, all of fire. But instead of a battle between the Syrians and these heavenly troops, Elisha prayed, and God struck the Aramean troops with blindness. And unable to see, Elisha led them right into Samaria, the city of the king of Israel. And once there, in front of the king, surrounded by Israeli troops, Elisha prayed that their eyes would be opened. And the king of Israel offered immediately that he could just kill the whole bunch of them. And Elisha said, but just a minute, you didn't capture them. I and God captured them. It's not, no, instead of killing them, wind them, dine them, and then send them home to their master. Some explaining they were going to have to do when they got home. Imagine. One spy in the midst of the Arameans, a whole troop has gone over to Israel. And the writers of the Deuteronomistic material tells us then the Arameans no longer came raiding into the land of Israel. So a happy ending. Eating with enemies. Surprising thing to do. Don't kill them, excommunicate them, or cancel them. Instead, eat with them. Confuse them. And God often does surprising and confusing things. And we have other stories of eating with enemies in the Bible. In Psalm 23, the psalmist, either David or someone writing, thinking about David in David's time, wrote, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." David often faced enemies in the royal courts. Beginning with King Saul himself and ending with some of his own sons, David had many who would have liked to replace him. He often had to eat in the presence of enemies, but he felt God's help and safety. And then, like I already told the story, we have the Last Supper. Jesus, knowing that Judas had already sold him for 30 pieces of silver, that's the price of a slave, still washed Judas' feet, ate with him, had communion with him. Now, that didn't turn out very well, though, because Jesus died the death of a slave on a cross. And actually, 2 Kings doesn't stay happy either, because right in the next verses after the ones that we read, sometime later, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mustered his entire army, and he marched against Samaria and laid siege to it. As the siege continued, famine in Samaria became so great that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. Remember, Jesus was sold for 30. A donkey's head, 80. 1/4 of a cab of dove dung for 5 shekels of silver. I'm not sure why that's included in the food list here. Really don't want to know. But in this story, we read that cannibalism came into the city during the siege. It's not a happy ending at all, though in the end, again, God delivered the Samaritans and Israelites again with acts of power and confusion after much suffering. I guess that's also true with Jesus' story of the Last Supper, arrest and crucifixion, a happy ending later. We have a couple of pictures here. The first two pictures that I want to show are of the Last Supper. So now we have to go the other direction somehow. Way back, okay, right. So here we have a picture of the Last Supper. Go back one picture. There. We actually, you can't really see it, but I'm going to go over here and shout. The whole group here, and Jesus, and Judas is in here something. And Judas is right over here, close to Jesus, eating with him at the Last Supper. And you can look at the other picture up right now also. Jesus and Judas dipping into the same bowl together. When Paul wrote to, let's leave that picture up. When Paul wrote to the church in Rome, there was significant strife among the believers about eating, no less. Some non-Jewish believers and some Jewish believers felt deeply that they couldn't eat the meat that had first been offered to a god in a Roman temple. Much of the meat in the marketplace, by the way, was this kind of meat. The temples would take a little bit of the sacrificial meat, burn it, and the rest they would sell in order to prop up the temple. So other believers, Jewish and non-Jewish, had no problem with the meat. And so calls of idolater and sissy went back and forth among the people. And Paul called on the believers who could eat the meat to make peace with the others by sitting down with them and not having that meat while they were sitting with them, so the two groups could eat together. But then he asked the group who had problems with the meat to say, you can't tell them what to do when they're not with you. You need to let them go and eat that meat when they're not with you. So it's not really eating with enemies, it's eating with sisters and brothers, but ones with whom we deeply disagree. In 1529, during the Anabaptist Reformation, actually the Reformation in Zurich, of which the Anabaptist Reformation was part, the canton of Zurich went to war against the central Swiss cantons. Zurich was part of the protest against the Roman Catholic Church. That's where we get Protestant from, while the other cantons had remained Roman Catholic. The two armies met, and the leaders stepped aside to see if they could negotiate a solution. And while they discussed, the people from Zug, the central cantons, brought milk, and the people from Zurich brought bread, and the troops together made Milchsuppe, common dish among some Central European folk, continued to be eaten even to this day by some of our Amish and Amish Mennonite sisters and brothers. Think of Bohnensuppe, right? Bohnensuppe is made with milk and bread and beans, and right? I guess Janet's not a fan. So the story is told that the troops then ate the soup together. We can go to the next couple of pictures. Go forward, the other direction. We'll get there. There. Okay, so that picture in there is of the troops eating soup together. We can go to the next picture as well. Yeah, so they're eating their Milchsuppe together. And in the background, in the bushes, the leaders are having a conversation about what they're going to do. A monument's been raised on this place. Let's go to the next picture. You can see the cauldron there with the soup in it. Next picture. Kappeler Milchsuppe. That's the name of the place, is Kappeler, the Milchsuppe. And one more picture. This is an Anabaptist tour there. A friend of mine took some of these pictures when he was there. And it said that to this day, Kappeler Milchsuppe is still served if a dispute has been resolved through negotiations. As late as 2010, there was an argument between several of the cantons, and they negotiated a settlement, and then they made Milchsuppe together. But that story, this story of the Milchsuppe, has a sad ending as well. Let's go to the next picture. This is Ulrich Zwingli. He was the leader of the Reformation in Zurich. Let's go to the next picture. There's a picture of him here. And if you look really carefully, you'll see that he's leaning on his sword with his Bible under his arm, right? And then one more picture. This is his house in Zurich. This is a picture Amber and I took when we were there. And then one more picture forward. You have to go back. Okay, there. And this is this was Zwingli's house. And from this house, on the 11th of October, 1531, so 2 years after the Milchsuppe story, with the Lord, the people from Zurich went to Kappel and started a war. And Zwingli was killed on the battlefield himself that day. So, yeah. Eating with enemies. Another story. 1914. We just yesterday celebrated the end of that war, the 11th day of the 11th month, 11th hour of that day. No one believed in 1914 that war was going to go on for 5 years. The fact is, when the war started in August, everybody thought by Christmas it'll be done. But at Christmas time that year, the troops on both sides of no man's land spilled out into the trenches and fraternized with the enemy. We can go to the last picture now. Silent Night. This is a book that's written about this event. They played soccer. They exchanged German chocolate for English biscuits. They drank together. They sang Christmas carols together. The English knew Silent Night. The Germans knew Stille Nacht. They sang it together. When the truce was over the next day, many troops refused to shoot at the enemy with whom they had fraternized, celebrated the birth of Jesus just a few hours earlier. The generals had to move troops up and down the line, and so they were facing people they didn't know before the war could go on. Rather than shooting friends, people were now shooting enemies. A much more personal story. During COVID, some fractures in our family, Anne-Marie's and mine, grew deeper. Not our immediate one with our kids, but some of our relatives were strongly in favor of masking, vaccines, separation to protect the weak, and so on. And others thought the government was behaving like the beast in the book of Revelation and refused to get vaccines, masked only when they absolutely had to, met as often as they felt they could, and went around the rules often and made fun of people who were wearing masks and so on. But so Anne-Marie and I thought and believed that we need to keep on relating to all parts of the human and Christian spectrum. So when restrictions loosened up last year, we made an appointment to have dinner with 2 of the 3 couples, with her brothers and their spouses. But there were some ground rules, which we and they proposed. We couldn't talk about vaccines, we couldn't talk about end times, and we couldn't talk about accepting people who were homosexual. So we met, we talked about families, gardening, travel, joyful worship experiences. It felt a bit shallow at points, but the result was that we had more communication with them about things that we agreed that we could talk about. We had chances where we could pray for each other over the time in between as we'd gone through difficult experiences. Now, we had an appointment to meet with a 3rd couple, but they let us know that one of them was sick, and so we canceled that time, but then met with them another time. And together then at that time we planned a birthday party for Anne-Marie's dad's 90th, which was the 30th of September past, where we invited everybody to come to the party, all the siblings, all the families. There were 36 out of 40 of the family present that day. Enemies? Well, not really. But a sociologist I read once said that it's a lot easier to actually bridge chasms with people who are further away than people who are close by. And he was talking about Mennonite denominations trying to figure out things. Inter-Mennonite dialogue is harder than inter-Christian or even inter-religious dialogue. Family we disagree with, maybe not enemies, but not really allies either. It's pretty difficult. Maybe you're starting to think about who are your people you feel uncomfortable with, maybe not enemies, but the invitation is to eat with enemies. Now, there are times and situations where being with an enemy would not be safe. So this is not a blanket invitation to eat with enemies or people that you're uncomfortable with. Think before you reach out to enemies and about how or where to eat with them. Maybe rather than inviting them to your home, you have coffee in a coffee shop in public. I'm just checking the time. I have one more story. It's not about enemies, but it's an uncomfortable situation. I'm going to tell it. So May 16th, 2013, Anne-Marie and I were in Naples. We'd had a really full day. We'd gotten up really early in the day in the rain and headed off to Pompeii and Vesuvius. It was almost 6:30 when we returned to the hotel, and we got up to our room, cleaned up a little bit, and went down for dinner. Now, we'd been warned the day before several times, once by police and once by another woman on the street, just be careful, be careful, be careful. I was carrying this big camera, and people were going, oh. Naples is known as one of the least safe cities in Europe to go to, which means it's safer than most American cities, but it's still, in fact, this is what guidebooks tell you, not a very safe city, but it's safer than. So we decided to eat in the hotel restaurant. Besides that, we got a 10% break because we were staying at the hotel. Got to put that in there. The restaurant had a number of tables that were out along the street. So we came down the stairs, we saw a table for 4 up against the wall, so we sat up against the wall. The waiter came and moved the other half of the table over, about a foot, so somebody else could have it. We got our menus, and we took our time over the menus, and we ordered pasta. Now, you were just there. So we didn't order antipasta. We just ordered pasta, carne, insalate, and wine. Okay. Italian meals start with antipasta, which is usually like cheese and bread, sliced meats, pickles, and then the pasta, right? And then meat of some kind. Then followed by your salad after that, and then you can have dessert and coffee. And I was in heaven in Italy because coffee there is espresso. If you want a North American style coffee, they make you an espresso and then they dilute it with water. It's called an Americano. Italians usually have 2 sugars in each coffee, no cream. I don't know exactly what we ordered for pasta and carne, but I know we had a calabrese salad. Fresh tomato slices, fresh mozzarella or a bocconcino or calabrese, table cheese, balsamic vinegar, olive oil, salt and pepper, and fresh basil. We sat quietly, Anne-Marie and I, rehearsing the day's activities, what we had seen, how we'd experienced it all. Tired but satisfied, we were enjoying some downtime. Our pasta came. The pasta was really good. We didn't I think we were eating our meat, the carne, when two men came to the other table. By that point, it was after 8 o'clock. I acknowledged them and then turned back to Anne-Marie. It's a bit antisocial maybe, but I was tired. Within a minute, I was glad that I hadn't entered into conversation. Next table, excited noises, squeaky voices, wild gesturing was taking place, all at high volume. I assumed that we had two drunk guys sitting over here. And I studiously ignored them, not wanting to have to deal with difficult people. And that worked for about 5 minutes. When tap, tap on the shoulder, I looked over and he made noises at me. And I said, non parlo italiano. And then his partner said that in a high, strained voice, enunciating peculiarly in English, Inglese. And it connected to me right away. They weren't drunk. They were hearing and speech impaired. They wondered where we were from, what we had seen, small talk, all at high volume in whatever languages we could muster, Italian, English, German, French, accompanied by lots of hand gestures. At one point, the one man went like this. I said, yes, we had been at Mount Vesuvius today. They were going tomorrow. We talked a bit, and then our salad arrived. We ate in peace, talking quietly, and then another tap on the shoulder. He looked at us, the two of us, and then he made a heart. And he pointed at us. He said, yes, we're in love. I said, we've been married 35 anni. 35 anni, they exclaimed to Anne-Marie. And the conversation went out. Turns out that there was a group of 18 of them from northern Italy and Switzerland, all speech and hearing impaired. The conversation went on as more of their group joined us. We got decaf coffees, Anne-Marie and I. They ordered a calabrese salad, more wine. We talked of travel, of religion. They didn't think much of the Pope. Of marriages. One couple in their group had been married for 50 years. At one point, a cell phone video was being taken, and I volunteered to take the phone and being able to take everybody on the video and taking pictures. 11 o'clock, we got our bill. They offered to buy more wine. We could keep on talking, but we noted that we were leaving for Florence early the next morning. We needed to rest. 3 hours of sign, French, German, English, and guessing had made us all more tired. And as we climbed the stairs to our room, I wondered out loud to Anne-Marie about how friendly they had been, all of them. And then I wondered how well they were accepted in Italy, because my understanding, when there was a movie that Anne-Marie and I had watched just before we went, Italy, Love It or Leave It, had noted that there wasn't a lot of room for disabilities in Italy. We also wondered whether the two men at the next table were a couple, also not widely accepted in Italy. But we had just been people, with people who are like us, never mind people who are different. They were amazed, and so were we, at the good time that we had had together. It is hard enough to be at peace with people who are like us, never mind people who are different. And there's no guarantee that peace will hold. But for a time, if we reach out, there can be peace. For a time, people can flourish and do what they do best. For a time, we can even work together, like the birthday party for Anne-Marie's dad. And making peace is what Jesus calls on us to do, what he modeled for us. We are called to eat with our enemies, to make peace. So I ask you, who are your enemies? Join me in prayer, I pray. God of all people everywhere, your desire is for all humanity and the whole creation to exist in loving relationships with each other, even when there is disagreement. May your Spirit lead us and prompt us, strengthen us to eat with our enemies, with those with whom we are uncomfortable, to make your peace. Amen.